Welcome to Friday, and not just any Friday. This is the last Friday in 2021. I can't believe we've ridden the crest and actually survived. How wonderful. Now, not too long ago, I was listening to Brian Williams, one of my favorite journalists, and he mentioned a book, and I mentioned it to Mark, who ordered a copy. It's just been published, and I'll tell you, it has been a journey, a 680-page journey for me. And what it is The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III by Andrew Roberts. And I was familiar with Roberts because he wrote a book about one of my heroes, Winston Churchill, a wonderful biography. And I wasn't even aware that this book was in the works, but it is, and I have it in front of me. And now I'm going to share just two snippets of it with you. I'm going to go to chapter 9, and which is titled That Factious and Disobedient Temper, June 1769 to April 1772. This is a quote from George III. I do not pretend to any superior abilities, but will give place to no one in meaning to preserve the freedom, happiness, and glory of my dominions and all their inhabitants, and to fulfill the duty to my God and to my neighbor, and in the most extended sense. On June 3rd of 1769, a little over 2 weeks after witnessing a solar eclipse, George and Queen Charlotte observed the transit of Venus, a silhouette for a few minutes as it passed across the face of the sun, from the King's Observatory in Old Deer Park at Richmond. Now, the observatory had been designed especially for the event by Sir William Chambers and Dr. Stephen de Mainbray, and had been given to him by his mother as his 31st birthday present. It possessed a telescope with a magnification of 170. De Mainbray recorded that the king was the first who saw the penumbra of Venus touching the end of the sun's disk, the exact timing of which de Mainbray recorded using John Shelton's regulator clock. Now, this exceptionally rare astronomical event. Now, it has only happened 4 times since, in 1874, 1882, 2004, and 2012, caught the king's imagination, because as the ratio of the distances to the sun, the Earth, and Venus was known, it became possible to calculate the size of the sun itself, and thus the dimensions of the solar system, by observing the transit of Venus from different places on Earth at known distances, apart when the 3 bodies were all in alignment. This was one of the reasons George had donated £4,000 to the Royal Society to support Captain James Cook's expedition to Tahiti, where the event was also observed by astronomers. When the expedition returned under budget, the Royal Society used the remaining funds to commission a bust of the king from Joseph Nolanken's, which stands in its entrance hall today. George was an Enlightenment monarch for whom scientific discovery matters deeply. The observatory was used 4 years later for one of the most important experiments of the modern world. George had actively followed John Harrison's attempts to develop a clock accurate enough to establish longitude, and allowed his prototype H5 timepiece to be tested at the observatory. He also ensured that the Board of Longitude paid the octogenarian Harrison the last £8,750 of his $20,000 prize money in June 1773, which was being withheld according to a technicality. Harrison's son, William, claimed that the king had told his father, "By God, Harrison, I will see you righted," although the terminology and the use of the Almighty's name in an oath did not ring true. The board claimed to doubt whether Harrison's chronometer met the full criteria for improving methods to fix longitude of ships at sea. But following the further trial at the observatory, it was finally convinced that it did. Harrison gratefully presented the king with his fifth and last chronometer, accurate to within 4.5 seconds over 10 weeks. So potentially important was Harrison's invention, with its ability to pinpoint longitude to within 18 miles, which, of course, had significant naval applications, that the king was one of only 3 people entrusted with the key to inspect the H5. The others being de Mainbray and Harrison himself. On 13 March 1781, the astronomer William Herschel discovered a new planet, which initially he wished to name Georgium Sidus, George's star. Sadly for the king, it was instead given the classical name Uranus. The discovery overturned the fundamental conception of the solar system, which since ancient times had assumed there were only 6 planets. Herschel had originally come from Hanover in 1757 as a musician, but had mapped the heavens in his spare time and become a protege of de Mainbray. The king invited Herschel to an audience at Windsor on 25 May 1782, and along with the Queen, he went to the Kew Observatory to inspect Saturn and Jupiter. George appointed Herschel court astronomer, awarding him a pension of £200 per annum, and his sister Caroline, a distinguished astronomer in her own right, £50 per annum. The position of king's astronomer seems to have made him happier even than the pension, wrote someone who knew Herschel well, as it enables him to put into execution all his wonderful projects. The greatest of these was building 5 10-foot telescopes and one gigantic telescope, 44 feet long and 49 inches wide, the biggest in the world at the time, which cost George a literally astronomical £4,000. It was constructed in the field behind Herschel's home, Ivy House, at Slough, near Windsor, where he lived for nearly 40 years, and where he would go on to discover the existence of galaxies. On 24 August 1786, the Herschels came to Windsor to show the king and queen a new comet that Caroline had discovered. Caroline was to discover 7 more comets before 1797, and in her extraordinary 97-year life, she added a new star, 8 comets, and more than 500 nebulae and galactic clusters, 2 of which bear her name, to the catalogue of those known in the universe. Well, there's a touch of science there. And now I'm going to slip into the conclusion of the book. And in it, he says, Plato once said that not being tempted by power should be one of the primary qualifications of wielding it. Cincinnatus was called upon from the plow, George Washington from his farm. Now, George III took this to the limit, so despising political ambition that he often preferred prime ministers such as Grafton and North, who did not want the position. George certainly deserves much credit for spotting the younger Pitt, appointing and resolutely supporting a 24-year-old prime minister, who was a brave move even in the circumstances of the 18th century. Pitt was respectful, businesslike, and professional with the king, though never personally close. Pitt was aloof, socially awkward, an economic wizard, celibate, if not asexual, and a genius. George was none of these things, and evidently found the gulf between their characters too difficult to cross. After Pitt had offered opponents concessions to his finance bill, which watered down the original measure in March 1797, the king told him in an acute piece of self-analysis, "My nature is quite different. I never assent till I am convinced what is proposed is right. Then I never allow that to be destroyed by afterthoughts, which on all subjects tend to weaken, never strengthen the original proposal." That might be true, but it was not necessarily politically skillful. 3 years later, he spoke to Pitt in similar terms. "My opinion is formed on principle, not on events, therefore is not open to change." This adamantine inflexibility did not work against the American colonists, but it was precisely what his country needed in a later conflict. George believed that the French Revolution was a sinister development in modern politics, long before the clatter of the first tumbrel and the swish of the first guillotine blade, while opponents rapturously hailed the fall of the Bastille, saying, as Charles Fox did, "How much the greatest event it is that ever happened in the world, and how much the best." Only 6 years after losing the American War of Independence, Britain proved herself robust enough to withstand the shocks of the French Revolution and the subsequent 23 years of war with France, in part due to George's stewardship. "The times may be difficult," he told Pitt in 1795, "but with energy cannot fail of success." Despite his wide and deep intellectual interests, George was not typical of the Enlightenment in that he was profoundly religious, deeply traditional in his personal morality, and insistent on social conventions, all qualities which repelled the Whigs. In politics, he distrusted metaphysical abstractions quite as much as Edmund Burke. He was not, however, by any means a secret Tory or crypto-Jacobite, as was often said in the early years of his reign. He was intellectually, as well as politically, conservative, believing that although sometimes there were improvements in human affairs, None the less, there was no such thing as inevitable progress, and it was highly necessary to avoid all novelties. Now we know that all wise nations have stuck scrupulously to their ancient customs. When Lord Eldon became Lord Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, he asked the king whether he could stop wearing his heavy, long wig when not engaged on official functions, arguing the precedence of judges under James I and Charles I, who did not wear them. George replied that, given the precedent, Eldon would have to grow a beard, concluding, No, I will not have any innovations in my time. That was the essential nature of his conservatism. No innovations. Reform would always risk giving birth to greater evils than it aimed to cure. It was admirable not to change with the times. Yet, for all that, George was not a reactionary. To obviate future evils, he told Lord Shelburne in reference to Irish policy in May 1782, it is as material as to remove those of the present hour. This was his attitude to crime and punishment, too. He did not balk at the way British law dispensed condign punishment, although, as in the font of justice, he took his duty of dispensing mercy very seriously. And with the exception of Gordon rioters, he personally reviewed every capital case before execution was pronounced. On occasion, he did show clemency by commuting sentences. When General Conroy's secretary, James Sampson, stole £900 in banknotes in 1768, however, and attempted to burn down Conway's house to destroy the evidence, the king was unmoved to mercy. Now, I am sure that when this man is condemned, Conway will be teasing me to pardon him, the king was reported as saying, but I am determined to hang him. While 3 others on capital charges for rape and sheep stealing had their executions commuted by the king to transportation, Sampson was hanged at Tyburn. Notwithstanding his 18th century views on punishment generally, George was a supporter of the penal reform movement that started around 1770. He almost always accepted judges' recommendations for transportation for life instead of hanging, which was the standard penalty for a remarkably wide number of offenses. The theft of anything valued at more than £2, arson in the dockyards, forgery, damage to property, regular poaching, burglary, and scores of other crimes. The king contributed to the relief of debtors at a time when bankrupts were, self-defeatingly for their creditors, regularly imprisoned. Now, I'm going to skip out of the text and into a little story on my own. You may wonder, what the difference does that make? We're sitting here on Amelia Island. Well, I'll tell you, it makes a huge difference because George II, father of George III, had debtor's prison in place. And Oglethorpe, a man of some means, had a friend who was in debtor's prison, not being able to pay his debts, and nobody there to pay them for him. And Oglethorpe came up with this wild idea. Now, we all know that at this time there were colonies, and they had been established and were investment opportunities for the British to earn considerable profits on their investments. Well, what if it were possible to, let us say, come over to untested territory, earn money, pay your debts, and then become a viable subject of the king. What a remarkable idea. Well, Oglethorpe sailed across the ocean and in a disputed territory. You know, the English were indeed Protestants, and they had these colonies. But you know, right down below them, oh, there lived a whole nation of Catholics, despised Catholics. And South Carolina had problems with that. Well, in 1733, Oglethorpe sailed across the oceans, founded the colony, named strangely enough Georgia, after George II, and 3 years later was sailing down, saw this little island, well, not so little, but island, and decided, I'll name it Cumberland, after the Duke of Cumberland, who was one of the sons of George II. And then right down below him was a much smaller island, 13.5 miles long, 2.5 miles wide at its widest point, 11,600 acres, and he named it Amelia, after Amelia Sophia Eleonora, daughter of George II. So if you wonder if European history has any relevance to we sitting here on Amelia Island, I rest my case. And now I'm going to go back to the book. That last bit was me, unvarnished. The concept of honor is central to understanding George III, and he would not allow his own to be compromised. Never give up your honor nor that of the nation, his father had told him in his posthumous political testament, and the lesson, well received, remained with him throughout his life. Whenever George saw it threatened, he became immensely obstinate and determined. 2 examples of many will suffice. When George promised James Stuart Mackenzie the Lord Privy Seal of Scotland for life, he felt his honor compromised when he was forced by Grenville to dismiss him from the post in 1765. And it soured his relationship with both Grenville and his successor, Rockingham, who did not reinstate Stuart Mackenzie. Then, in 1801, when Pitt the Younger tried to bounce George into emancipating the Roman Catholics, he again perceived that his personal honor was at stake because it would force him to break his coronation oath. For him, these were moral issues. In the interests of my country, ever shall be my first care. My own inclinations shall ever submit to it, he wrote to Lord Bute, after having decided to give up his pursuit of the beautiful but wildly unsuitable Lady Sarah Lennox in the winter of 1759. I am born for the happiness or misery of a great nation, and consequently must often act contrary to my passions. Kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people, wrote Thomas Jefferson in 1774. Open your breast, sire, to liberal and expanded thought. Let not the name of George III be a blot in the page of history. It is not. In Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda's George III is presented as a cartoonish pantomime villain, desperate for affection. In one of the production's best and unquestionably its funniest songs. "You'll be back," George delivers the delightfully deranged line to his sweet, submissive subjects, that when push comes to shove, I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love. Having read this book, do you think that is how George III should be seen? Well-meaning, hard-working, decent, dutiful, moral, cultured and kind, yet cursed to lose his mind no fewer than 5 times, and also to preside over the loss of the American colonies. George III is one of the most tragic monarchs of Britain's history, as well as being the most underestimated and misunderstood. I shall have no regret never to have worn the crown, his father had written to him in his posthumous political testament, if you but fill it worthily. George III more than filled the role of King of Great Britain. Worthily, he filled it nobly. And so, I've broad-brushed so much. There are so many pages here of the details of the story, but everything from the Stamp Act to our own Revolutionary War story, so much of it before and after is in this book, and I cannot encourage you enough to pluck it from the shelves of story and song and find out how to reevaluate the lens of history. Speaking of which, our lens of history of the year 2021 is getting dimmed. We're losing focus. But we're going to see such wonders in 2022 that I can't wait for it to begin. Till then, thank you for sharing this time with us.